This time on the Prop Master, well, we start that last big push before Halloween and finish the helmet. I'm not fooling anyone. It is December and it's freezing out here. Okay, this is a little bit more comfortable. And I guess I've got some explaining to do. See, my intention was to finish the helmet before Halloween, and I did, but only at the expense of this video. You see, I finished the helmet on the 27th and feverishly started the editing process, but I could immediately tell this was going to be trouble because, to my surprise, I found that I had about 7.5 hours of raw footage, and I needed to cram all that into 60 to 90 minutes of video. That's, a pretty big task. Nevertheless, that's what I started to do, and for the next 2 days, I did pretty well. In fact, the end was in sight, except I did promise my kids 2 Mandalorian costumes, not helmets. So, in the end, I basically had to abandon working on the video, and for the next 36 or so hours, worked straight through and knocked out a reasonably good set of costumes. As you can see, they actually turned out fairly well considering how much time I had to do it. I pretty much spent all that time since then cleaning and repairing all the damage that I've made that, you can only make when you pull one of those last-ditch all-nighters. Just sort of throwing everything on the floor and abandoning everything as I was doing it. And trust me, the shop, the house, the backyard, everything was trashed. But anyway, let's get back to turning the regular old Clan Wren Mandalorian helmet into Sabine Wren's helmet. And make no mistake, painting Sabine's helmet is going to be a challenge. It's definitely more difficult than Boba Fett or Jango Fett. But that said, I've done a lot of things that are going to make the job as easy as possible. Now, first off, I've made a set of templates to help things go along a little bit easier. And whenever possible, I've avoided mixing colors. And if you're going to paint your helmet the same as this one, then I've put a list of all the colors that you're going to need, all the paints you're going to need, down below. Now, if you want to go with your own colors or Sabine's colors from a different season, then the templates will still help out quite a bit. And speaking of paints, my suggestion to you is to go out and invest in one of these 48 packs of the Liquitex Basics acrylic paints. And before you comment on anything, no, I'm not being sponsored by Liquitex or anything like that. I just went out and looked around until I could find a set of acrylic paints that had all the colors that I needed and wasn't too expensive. And this was the best thing that I could find. Now, this 48 set of paints is not cheap, but it's not that expensive either. And trust me, you'll have plenty of opportunities in the future to use these. I'm sure you could buy them individually, but I can almost guarantee that you'll end up spending more money doing that than if you just buy the set. Of course, if you don't want to paint it the way I've painted it or want to use your own paints or just, go completely rogue, that's fine. I still suggest watching the video because I also am going to cover weathering and attaching the rangefinder and, of course, putting the tent on at the end. One last thing that I want to go ahead and talk about, because I don't really cover it in the video, and that is what I did on the inside in order to fit the helmet to my daughter. I mean, it fit before, but it was loose and wobbly, and with the rangefinder, it wants to lean a little bit this direction. So you kind of have to get some individual fitting in there just so that it's snug and secure. Now, the first thing that you're going to want to do is to put the helmet on and make sure that your eyes line up, with the eye holes comfortably. If not, usually what happens is they're just a little bit too low, and you're kind of, looking up at this part of the helmet. And for that, you just want to add usually like just a round piece of your foam. You can do as many layers as you need to make your eyes line up right. I've done this twice so far for my kids, and in both cases it just took one piece of the EVA floor mat thickness. I'll go ahead and put that directly in the center. And then also that same thickness, you can see, I put this little piece in here right at the forehead level, and the same thing in the back. And then I put a strip right down the sides at the ears. So right along here, along with the ears, to kind of keep it side to side. And that still wasn't enough, so I went ahead and put a second piece in right here on top of that, and just kind of built it up. You do that until it's comfortable but snug. Just so it's not, when you move your head, you don't want it to rattle around. On my son's, I ended up adding a couple of small pieces right up here in the cheekbone area. You just want to make sure that you can still put the helmet on and take it off. And so as you can see, we've got a lot of work to do, so let's get started. So I know it looks like I've started without you, but in truth, I've had to do a lot of experimentation to try and get the pattern correct and the color style correct. And I finally, after a dozen different sketches on the helmet, having to repaint over each time, I think I've finally come up with a good pattern and a process for painting her helmet so that it will not only have, if not perfectly accurate, close to accurate colors, it'll also have the same style that you see in Rebels. And to do that, I've, after a lot of experimentation, chosen to go with Liquitex Basics acrylic paints. You can find them at most art stores, Michael's, probably Hobby Lobby, but I'm not sure. It's a pretty common brand of paint. And because these are translucent colors, they're not opaque colors. Because they're translucent, instead of having to mix the paints together, you can do layers of paint to get the right shades. That also gives you a nice texture, like you can see through here. It's hard to see in the light here. But it does a good job of simulating what the illustrations look like on Star Wars Rebels. The problem is, unless you have a bunch of Liquitex Basics paints, you're going to have to go out and buy some paints, because you're going to need to use the same color and type of paint that I'm using, otherwise it's not going to work out. Unfortunately, that means that if you followed my lead in the last video and painted your helmet silver the way I did, then the first step in this whole process is that you are going to have to repaint your helmet with the primer filler. Because unfortunately, the latex paints do not stick to most spray paints. And once you've covered your helmet with the filler primer, then you're going to go ahead and have to cover the entire helmet with the Liquitex Basics Neutral Gray Value 5, and just cover the whole helmet that way so that it's neutral gray. Otherwise, it's just going to be too dark. And if you are dead set on having the silver, then you can go ahead, after you do the basics, you can do a couple of coats of the Liquitex Basics Silver. It's translucent, so you'll need to do at least 2 coats, but it goes on pretty well, and it's a nice effect. That's what you can see here now. And once you do that, then you'll need to follow the link that I have down below, and you'll find an entire set of templates that I've made. There's a left and a right set of templates. So go ahead and download and print those out. You can just use regular paper on those. You do not need to use cardstock. And after that, you'll have to decide what season of Sabine's paint you want to use. Luckily, the pattern seems to be the same for all 3 seasons so far. I learned that the hard way after I followed some Lucasfilm documents that showed a different pattern, and then I went back and saw some screen captures and saw that they didn't change the pattern at all. So this is a season 3 paint scheme, so hopefully you want to go with the season 3. Otherwise, you're going to have to come up with your own colors, but at least the patterns will be the same. And some of the colors will be the same as well. So once you've chosen your season and downloaded the templates, we can go ahead and start with the next part of the process. So once you have printed out the templates, you're going to want to go get some contact paper. This is just like shelf lining. It's a plastic sheet that you can put down on cabinets or shelves, drawers, just to protect it. You're going to want to make sure that you get the clear. You can usually find that at a grocery store. If you can't find it at the grocery store, you can find it at Home Depot. Most home stores are going to carry something like this. Just make sure you get the clear. One thing real quick, when you're looking at the pattern, you'll see that there are some lines that are different colors than black. Green ones here and blue here. That just shows that that's not part of the pattern. You can just cut this out the way it is here, and these little stripes will kind of hold everything in position. If it turns out you can't make that work, then you can go ahead and cut them out individually and place them. But I would at least start out by cutting this out basically in this entire pattern. Here, these little blue lines here, you will want to copy these down when you're drawing this out, because this is going to show you the position where this goes on the helmet. This is essentially the ear trim piece, and this will show you where this lays on top of that piece. I'll show you more when we actually start putting the pieces on. The important thing is you're going to want to go ahead and mark the green and blue lines either with dash lines or dot lines, or just, just remember that they're there and not to cut them out. You can just do regular lines. Anyway, you just want to transfer your templates onto the contact paper. You do not need to use a light table. This is just the only way I could get this to show up on camera. Put the contact paper down, make sure that it is on the clear piece that you're gonna outline this in, and not on the backer paper that gets pulled off. So just lay this down and go ahead and trace your outlines. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect. Unfortunately, the templates are just going to be guidelines, because there's just so many variables that there's no way that your helmet's going to be the same as my helmet, or even the left side be the same as the right side on my helmet. So these are basically just going to be guidelines. You want to go ahead and transfer any other information that's on here, like the numbers and the letters that are on here. Okay, and once you have that outlined, you can go ahead and just cut it out. I already have all of my pieces cut out. Now, if you notice on your pattern, you'll have an R or an L for left or right, and you'll have a number And in some cases you'll have an A down here. That's actually left over from when I was doing a different set of patterns, but this will come in handy because this will show you where this meets up with a different piece of the pattern. So the number that's here is basically going to tell you what's the best order to put these on the helmet. So start out with 1. I'm on the right side of the helmet, so I've got the right side pattern. And then start out by taking the back off of at least half of it. Okay. The important part about this pattern is this little notch. It comes down at an angle, has this little notch right here. That, and of course this bottom edge. So you want to try to line this notch up with this corner. Stick it down just a little bit. So try to get it in position and then this bottom edge into position. Once you get that roughly into position, you can go ahead and kind of push everything down. Now, like I said, this is more of a guideline. It's not going to be exact. The reason why I went with this contact paper is because it'll stretch and go into the places, you know. See right here, you can see that this does not line up with the top like it should. And that's just the way it's going to be because it's not going to be exact. But this really isn't important at all. In fact, I can just stop worrying. This is the important part here in the front. And here's this part of the pattern. Okay, so here's the part where my microphone became disconnected, so I'm going to try and voice over on this and hopefully it all makes sense. So in part 2, the first thing you want to do is to make sure that this A corner meets up with this A from the first pattern. And once you have these two parts lined up, the next thing you want to do is define this corner piece, and it needs to line up with that same notch that you used in the pattern number 1. So those need to come together like that. Now this corner right here, it needs to line up with the very bottom of the ear module, hopefully at the point where that bottom edge of the trim starts to move back up. And beyond that, you just want to make sure that the bottom edge lines up with the bottom of your helmet. Now because of the curve of the helmet, it's going to be difficult to get this flat. Just do your best. What's really important is to make sure that you get a nice smooth line along that arch at the top. If it's a nice smooth line and it's in pretty much the position you want it to be in, then that's the important part. So you're probably going to have some creases in here, and that's totally okay. Just try to do your best to smooth everything out. But there's a really good chance you're going to have some bubbles or some creases in there. And once you have this in position where everything looks like it lines up where you want it to be, then you can go ahead and
trace everything out. Now I like to use a really soft lead pencil like this 6B. It's a extremely soft lead. It'll make a dark mark. I just find that it's easy to see on the surface, and as opposed to a marker, it's covered up by the paint very easily. A marker would be easy to see as well, but if you use a marker, it's most likely going to show up through your paint. It doesn't have to be a 6B, but some type of extremely soft lead pencil is the way to go, in my opinion. Now the areas that you want to outline are this lower wing right here. Get all the way around that. This little triangular piece right here. These little rectangular pieces, which, by the way, do not line up with the other two little winglet parts. I think that's just Dave Filoni messing with us again. And then, of course, this top line right here that's going to run down that cheekbone area, at least the lower edge of it. Notice it does not line up right along with the lower edge of the cheekbone, but actually comes off from the bottom of the ear module. And once you've finished your outlining, you can go ahead and pull off these templates just so they're not in the way. Now's the time to make sure that your lines are all there and darken anything up that is too light. Now for template number 3, you want to find this corner piece right here. And that's the part that you want to line up with the corner of your visor trim or mandible trim, whatever you want to call it at this point. Go ahead and get that lined up and pressed into position. You can just kind of check and make sure that your angles work at this point. Don't worry if that's not long enough or if it's too long. And make sure that this top part, the angle works on that. It'll be able to run along the lower edge of the eye. And once you have everything lined up the way you want it, you can go ahead and press it really well into position and then pull the paper off. Everything should kind of fall into position on its own, but you can kind of line everything up, make sure that the top edge of the template runs along the bottom edge of the eyepiece. Once you're happy with that position, you can kind of press everything down. You're really only worried about that lower edge as far as it being really smooth. So get that pressed down, and hopefully this end should stop right at the edge of the ear module. In this case it's sticking a little bit further, but that's fine. And that should line up with that little bud at the top of the ear module. Like I said before, this is just a guideline. It's not going to be perfect. Once you're happy with it, you can go ahead and mark that line. Once again, notice that this line does not line up with the lower edge of the mandible trim. It's actually down a little bit further and lines up with that little bud on the at the base of the rangefinder stalk. And now you're ready to pull this off as well. Okay, now for pattern number 4. Now this forwardmost edge needs to continue on a parallel path with the back edge of the ear module. As the ear module curves forward underneath, this should continue down to the bottom of the trim piece and should run along the bottom of that trim as well. Once you have that, you can go ahead and pull the paper off, and the back edge needs to run along and continue along the edge of the trim piece as well. And it kind of looks like it's off on the video, but it's right along the edge of the flat portion of that trim piece. Now the rest of this should fall along with the rest of the trim, but it doesn't really matter because we're not really worried about those lines. Just make sure that this part is in position. And then go ahead and take your pencil, and you're really worried about this edge right here, as well as these sort of inside lines. And that's it. I know these templates are kind of elaborate for the few parts that you're actually using, but I started out with a different process and had to kind of change it. And I think I'm about to realize that my microphone was unplugged and things should be back to normal. Okay, for number 5, what we want to do is to make sure that this back edge lines up with the line, and second of all, that this top edge lines up right at the top here. Okay, so don't worry about whether or not this bottom edge lines up with that angle, because you already have that marked. And we just want to mark this line right here. Okay, and the second number 5 is just this little piece here. And we're just going to line it up with the other one like that. Just put it on the top part of that seam. Don't worry about trying to connect it all the way to the lines. So in other words, don't try to push it to where this lines up here. You just want it to line up back here on this edge, not that edge. And draw that mark. So next up is going to be around the eye. Okay, for this complex of pieces, 6 through 10, try to keep them together. And what you want to do is, this edge is sort of a continuation of this. So this comes up and this should line up with that. At the same time, 10 should be pretty close to the back of the eye and up just a little bit. So it won't be touching this edge, but it'll be up just maybe 1/8 of an inch. So I'm lining the bottom of this up with that edge, and this outside edge is kind of a continuation of this front piece that goes up. And this needs to come where it's just a little bit above. Now let's see if this all works. Okay, so here it is. This is in the right place. Just a little sort of lined up with the back of the eye and just a little bit up from the edge. This I had to distort a little bit. It's not following along that eye, but it's, you know, I can just follow this line down. Try to make sure that on this piece here that you don't have any creases or anything in that, because that needs to be nice and smooth. But this does essentially, you know, roughly lines up with this line here. So now that I have that, go ahead and draw my lines. And just make this continue on down. So in case you do have to cut this part out, this is just a little oval and it needs to be a little bit higher in this back edge. So it's angled a little bit down this way. So like this end will be a little higher than this end. And it needs to be pretty close to the bottom. Okay. Can finally peel this one up. And just fill any gaps. If you can't see your lines, just keep moving the helmet around to different angles and probably the lines will suddenly appear. And there's just one piece left, and that is this main wing. Number 11. Okay, so for number 11, you have these little, I've drawn them as dotted little dashes here. They need to line up with this corner. So the inside dash needs to line up on this bottom part of the corner. And it's probably going to take a few tries, because this piece really twists around. So this little corner here needs to come down and touch the very top edge there. And then this piece should wrap around the base and sort of touch the same line that comes up here following that mandible trim. So they should be very close to touching. And then this just goes across. And go ahead and trace that one. So this edge should basically come down here and just kind of skim that corner, then continue down in a bit of an arc. And then it comes in and should pretty much touch this line here. Now that you have all of your lines on here, you can kind of go in and sketch in anything if it's not really there very well. Just darken that up a little bit. If anything's not really meeting up where it should, you can sort of fix that at this point. Like if these two lines didn't quite connect, you can kind of go ahead and adjust that. But I think it looks good, considering I took those patterns from the other side of the helmet. You know, they're a little bit off, but they worked pretty well. Okay, so now that we have that, we can kind of go on to painting. So once you have your pattern drawn on both sides, you're going to want to look at it from the top and make sure that these back wings line up across the helmet, as well as these here. Because if one of these is, you know, way up front or way behind, that's not going to work, and so you're going to need to sort of mark how that should look and then adjust your angle. Mostly just for these two.
But if it's really obvious that something's wrong up here, then you'll have to do it up here as well. But that's not likely to happen. It's really these wings back here you have to worry about. Once you have everything symmetrical, then you can come to the front, and you can see on mine there was some weirdness here. Early on in the process, somehow I managed to distort this piece here to where it's much further to the right side instead of being symmetrical. And so I had to make some adjustments here. I kind of drew a line to where it should be, and I'll go ahead and paint that the light blue color that also goes on the inside of the eyes all the way around, so that they'll kind of bring that back to center. Unfortunately, I can't do a pattern for this top piece because there's just too many variables. It has to look right with both sides of the helmet, and it's just, it would be very unlikely that that's going to happen. So basically you just want to measure out from here about 3/8 of an inch, and you can make a few lines across, and then you can kind of sketch in to connect the dots. But you want to start out with a line that just follows this line here out about 3/8 of an inch until you get to the end. Do that on both sides. And then when you get to the back of this eyelash piece, I guess, that's about 1/8 of an inch. So from there you just want to make a nice gradual change so that it meets up here at about 1/8 of an inch. So from 3/8 into 1/8. Do that on both sides. And you want to come past that, about a 1/2 an inch. Just going to continue your line about 1/2 an inch past the end here. And then you want to come down about 3/4 of an inch, making the line at the same angle, follows this angle here, about 3/4 of an inch on both sides. And then you just want to find that light is just in the worst spot. You want to try to find the center of the helmet just back a little bit, maybe a 1/2 an inch from where the two wings line up. And there you want to just basically make a nice arc that is about 1/8 of an inch from the wingtips, and at that point it's going to change arcs to meet up in the middle here. So it basically would just be kind of an arc that goes over all the way across, but here in the middle you're just going to come into a little point. And you know, you can alter your measurements here and there just to make sure that it looks good when you're looking at it. Everything looks symmetrical. You might have to make one of these a little bit longer than the other one just to make them look right. If you'll notice, we have this little shape here. And what this does is that you're going to follow the eyelashes down to a point here. Just kind of, you know, with your eye, follow that arc down to get to a spot here on this bottom piece. And then from there, you're just going to curve about 3/4 of the way down to this line here. So toward the ear, you go about 3/4 of the way, then stop, and then change an arc that comes down to this mark here, but it'll be a shallower angle, and it really kind of is basically line up. So we're going to go about 3/4 of the way down, and we're going to curve in toward the ear. And then, you can see this or not. And they don't have to be exactly the same on both sides. So now I have that mark. Now we can start painting. Okay, we're going to start out with the sort of purplish colors. Goes down here. And to achieve that color, you need to use 3 different colors. And we're not going to mix them beforehand. We're just going to do layers. And the first layer we're going to use is deep violet. You don't need very much. Found a spot where you can see. You want to kind of do this in sort of the direction of the shape. If you try really hard, you could probably put an opaque layer of paint on. Try really hard not to do that. Just, you know, fight that impulse. Just try to maintain a single direction on the paint. At this point, I'm just kind of smoothing out any big globs I've got. Boy, this is a lot easier when I'm not trying to do this on camera. Okay, well, that's reasonably good. So now that I have this, I'm going to speed up the drying process just a little bit. Okay, so once you have this layer down, take a regular blow dryer, hair dryer, put it on its hottest setting. I usually go with about 30 seconds on high heat, and then I turn it to cool and do it for another 30 seconds. And that's completely dry. And you want to go ahead and do that for the little eyeball here and the eyelashes here. Although you don't need to let this dry in between. Just go ahead and do all of these pieces in that color. Okay, now that all this is dry, you probably noticed that I went in with some of the neutral gray just to touch up some of the lines where I went completely, out of control. It's the same color, it just doesn't have the reflective qualities that the silver has. So the next color we're going to use is a quinacridone magenta. And don't worry, that'll all be spelled out down in the information area. Let's see if I can do a little bit better job with this coat. And I know you can see dark spots and light spots and streaks. That's all kind of what we're looking for, actually. Okay, so I'll dry this off real quick and we'll do the next layer. Now that that's dry, we're going to finish it off with some Prism Violet. Prism Violet is definitely the bluest of the three. We'll just keep adding the Prism Violet until we get the color that we're looking for. So probably one layer will do it, but if not, we'll let this dry and we'll do another layer on top of it. It's the additions of all these different layers that give this
that Rebels/Clone Wars painterly quality. I'm still kind of trying to go in sort of the direction that the graphic is in. We'll dry this and take a look at it and see how it compares to the other side. Now that it's dry, I'm pretty happy with that color. It looks pretty much the same as the other one. On camera it doesn't because the light's shining right there on it, but it looks like the other color, and it looks like the color that I see in my screenshots. So I'm happy with that. The last thing we want to do on the eyes and eyelashes is on the eyeball itself. We want to take some of your, I'm not sure why that stopped recording, but it did. So I just took my red and I just painted this little circle in here so that there is a purple sort of outline that runs around, kind of starts halfway in the front and runs around all the way until pretty much the middle of the bottom. And I just use that red to fill in the rest of the eye, except for that little arc that goes around. So now that we have that done, we want to go ahead and do this part right in here. And you do this the exact same way as we did the eyes and the eyelashes with those 3 different colors. The only thing I want to call your attention to is you're going to need to draw a couple of lines. One of them runs almost on the edge, but just a little bit on the forward side, you know, in front of the ledge. I'm going to draw a line that runs all the way down, just barely on there. So maybe 132nd of an inch from the edge. So just barely inside on that. And it comes up to about maybe a 1/16 of an inch from the top here. So once you have your line that's right here that stops at a 1/16 of an inch from the top, you want to come up here, and starting in this corner you want to draw a line diagonally back to about 3/4 of an inch from the edge. And then you want to go about twice that distance back to here, and then just draw a line diagonally from there down to that 1/16 of an inch spot where you stopped here on both sides. And you don't want to put the purple, you want to keep the purple inside those lines, not on the outside, because that's going to be blue. And I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera because it's exactly the same process as we did up here. Okay, so here it is after that first coat of Prism Violet. You can see here how you have the one streak here along this edge, and then the one little piece there at the top, and then this line that runs right down the front, both sides. And here it is after that coat of Prism Violet. So it all matches nice. Now when you're doing these, make sure that your brush strokes are all up and down until you get about here, and then they're all horizontal this way. Now we can work on this shape here, which is going to be black, but you don't want to go super heavy on it. It's almost like a sort of a dark gray compared to the rest of it, which is more of a solid black. You want to use ivory black for this. They also make a black called Mars black, but it is pretty much opaque, whereas this is another translucent color. And with this, much like I talked about on here, we want to make sure that our brush strokes are all this way. And it's going to be streaky, but that's a good thing. Now, when you get to this part, you basically want to bring the black all the way up to that 1/4 inch where the trim meets the wood. Okay. Actually, I think one coat is going to be good for that. If I put on more than one, it's going to get way too opaque. In fact, I may go back over parts of this with that gray, the neutral gray like I did on this side. I'll hit this with a blow dryer and then I'll come back with a little bit of gray. Now that this black is dry, I'm just going to take a little bit of the neutral gray and I'm just going to wipe most of it off. I'm just going to do a little bit of a dry brush on here. I want it to be lighter right in this area here. You can kind of go sideways with the brush too if you don't want to do too much area at once. Get a little bit more gray. It's going to wipe most of it off. I'm just kind of targeting some of the darker spots. You get kind of a bright line like that, and just go sideways with the brush and try to feather it all out. You can always come back with some black. Do the same thing with the black. Get a little black. Wipe most of it off. Now I'm just targeting some of the areas where it got really, really gray. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. Those look about the same. Now we can go ahead and do the other pieces of black, which are these little rectangles here and the little arcs that go into the two wings. Now you can use the same ivory black on those as well. You'll just have to do maybe 3 coats of black on those. Or you can go with the Mars black, which is a lot more opaque. I'm just going to try it with the ivory black, because I think I can get more of a painterly look to it. And I want to try to keep the brush moving up in the direction of the wing. So it's definitely easier to do it with the Mars black, just because it goes on more opaque. You can kind of find your lines and just do it. So I think what I'm going to have to do is I'll do 2, maybe 3 coats of the black, and then I'll probably have to come in with some gray and clean up my lines a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to blow dry those and then put a second coat on. We'll see how that looks. So here it is after the second coat dried, and I've cleaned up the edges with gray and then gone over that with silver. You can compare it to this, which is the
Mars black, which is a little bit glossier, a little deeper black. But I can fix that there at the end. This is a little bit nicer, you know, it's more matte, which is nice, but it was a lot more work. And it doesn't really, it's not that different from here. So I would be tempted to just go ahead and buy a tube of the Mars black as well and do these in Mars black. You can do it in ivory black. It's just going to take 2 to 3 coats of it, and it's kind of a pain to use. But it also has kind of a nice effect, so it's up to you. I'm going to go ahead and do this piece, the big wing in the Mars black, and it'll make it a little easier to compare. Getting this where you can see it and I can see the line. It's a bit of a challenge. So right away you can see that it's a much deeper black. So you can see it's definitely a lot quicker and easier to use the Mars black. Although I kind of like the finish of the ivory black. But I think I can fix that with some matte spray at the very end. Okay, so there we have the black parts. Next, yellow. So before we get started on the yellow, there is one other option you can do for the black wing parts here, and that is use the Mars black to do one layer and then just come back with the ivory black on top of that. That'll give you the easier coverage and easier to line everything up with for the Mars black. But then you can go ahead and get the little bit more of a matte finish from the ivory back. Okay, so I've been doing some more experimenting on the yellow, and I've got a pretty good formula, I think. It's a little different than I did on this side, is the only problem. So looking on the camera, and it's more yellow on the camera than it is in real life. It's a little bit more orange in real life, which is kind of goes to one of the problems with doing Sabine's color scheme, is that depending on how your TV is set up, your colors are going to be different. Okay, you can start this in 2 ways. So originally I used a base coat of titanium white over the silver. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try something a little different, and that is a base coat of unbleached titanium, just a slightly different color. If you don't want to buy another color, you know, you can go ahead and use white on there, but I'm going to try the unbleached titanium. It's just a little bit warmer. I guess in the end we'll see how they match up. I know the white will most likely give more streaks. So if you want to go with that exaggerated brushstroke texture, then white might be a better choice. I'll have to go look and see. I'm not sure whether or not the yellow on this transfers to the sides of the helmet, you know, the side pieces here. I think I'm going to leave them silver right now. The only pictures I have of the back of the helmet are in the original paint scheme. Okay, so once you have everything coated with your unbleached titanium or white, depending what you want to do, go ahead and hit that with the blow dryer and we'll put the next layer on. Okay, so everything's dry, so the next thing's up. The next thing that's up is the cadmium yellow deep hue. It's a very warm goldish yellow, which looks very, very pale yellow on the camera. Yeah, I'd say this color is a lot more of a cheddar cheese color in real life, whereas on the screen it looks more mustard yellow. Okay, so there's the deep hue cadmium yellow. We'll dry that off and then we'll put the next layer on. If you notice that I'd forgotten to paint this, I did notice that and I went back and did it. Okay, so the next color is cadmium orange hue. Excuse me. Now at this point, if you don't want to cover the entire area, that's okay. If you miss a few spots, that's going to make it look a little bit more like it does on camera. You have permission to get a little bit sloppy. You still want to try to get at least partially all the way up to this black edge here, because you don't want it to be a yellow line running down there. You can miss some, but don't miss that whole boundary. Okay, time to dry this off. Okay, this is all dry, so we're just going to tone this down a little bit with some yellow oxide. Okay, so I'll put this under the blow dryer and then we can kind of take a look at the two different sides. Okay, so everything's dried off now, and I think the difference between the white, backing it in white and in the unbleached titanium, the overall hue is the same, but we got a lot more streaks, a lot more paint brush stroke detail in this side. This is overall much more smooth. So it's kind of up to you if you want to go something more like this or something more even like this. Okay, so before we talk about the blue, let's talk about some of the things that I've done since the last time you saw me. The main thing that happened is that the first 2 episodes of season 4 of Star Wars Rebels came out, and there are some really great images of Sabine's helmet in those episodes. And because of that, I was able to see some details that I had missed previously. So I went ahead and made those changes, and I want to bring you up to date. First off is that whereas this ear pretty much stays the same, just being gold here and silver on the sides, the left ear is pretty much yellow all over, except for this little knob on top. That stays silver, but then you have this little piece of yellow here. So basically you just want to draw a line that follows the contour of this edge, come in about between 1/8 and 1/16 of an inch, and just follow that contour all the way around, kind of fudging to make the sides straight, and that gets the yellow treatment as well as everything else. You of course want to do all of that at the same time you do the yellow. The other thing is, on the right side, everything pretty much stays the same, except you also want to do this little arch. Just follow the contour again, but then just come in and make it a little arch or little rainbow. The other thing that I noticed is, we haven't really gotten there yet, but on this part here that's going to be sort of orange red, instead of being consistent all the way up here and then fading into 1/8 of an inch in this corner, it looks like it stays at pretty much 1/8 of an inch consistently through this entire eyelash area, and then slowly blends back in with this about halfway down, and then this straightens back out again. That's of course the same on both sides. The other thing that I did, so I painted this underside black, but then I came in a little bit on top so that it just kind of visually looks like the point is actually, you know, further this way, just to balance that out a little bit. So if you have a similar issue, you know, you can correct it that way. Now we can go ahead and worry about this blue color here. And it's a difficult color. Unfortunately, the base colors that we're going to be working with are not very translucent, so I can't really use the same techniques that we did earlier on in the build. I've tried to avoid it this entire time, but I can't avoid it any longer. We're going to have to mix up a color for this blue. It's going to be made up of these three colors here, which are cobalt blue hue, light blue violet, and our old prism violet from earlier. This will be the main color with a little bit of accents of the other two. And I can't figure out any way to really give you a ratio or anything to make it, you know, where you can be sure to do it easily. The best thing I can come up with is if you can go to a Sherwin-Williams store and get a paint swatch for Sherwin-Williams SW6817. So when you do this, you're going to want to mix up a fairly large amount because you have to do quite a bit. And you want to mix up, if anything, more than you need, because you don't want to have to remix this halfway through the process and try to make sure that it matches exactly. So you're going to want to put a pretty good amount of your light blue violet, and then you want to take your cobalt blue hue and nowhere near as much, not quite as much of the violet as you did of the cobalt blue. Looks like it's maybe a little bit light and it needs a little bit more the violet. So I'm just going to start by adding some violet to that. And that was why I was trying to avoid mixing colors, is because it's just so difficult. No matter what ratios I give you, it's going to be really difficult to just do it and have it match perfectly. You're going to have to, you know, look at the color and try to match it. I mean, the other thing you can do, of course, is just pause the screen on your TV. And I found some images, some screenshot images that were close, but they just didn't seem to be as good a color as I was actually getting on my TV. Got some areas on here where it does not want to stick. So I think, you know, sometimes you may have to just come back and do a second coat, at least in some areas. Now you don't actually have to get this perfectly up against this line, because at the end we're going to go in with some silver and put these outlines around all these shapes. Now, one thing that I did notice on this last episode was there was a great shot of just the sort of the eye area, and the eyelash on hers is, instead of being sort of a horizontal rectangle shape, it's closer to a square, and if anything, maybe slightly rectangular vertically. But I don't think I'm going to do anything about that now. This actually works, and you know, there's probably never going to be a time when I don't see things that are inconsistent with what I've got. So at some point you just kind of have to say, okay, this is the way I'm going to do it. So you just want to take the blue all the way down to the yellow border area, and all around everything to where that spot where you know, drawing your outline where the red area is going to go. And don't worry about making sure that everything's perfect, because it's supposed to have faded spots and darker spots, and you'll even have to come back in a little bit and add more. Try not to go over your black though. Okay, try to smooth out any ridges like that was right there. Okay, let that with a blow dryer, and then we'll go on to the next step. Oh, actually, I need to do this area here. Switching to a smaller brush. Now make sure you don't have a big blob of paint on your brush when you start doing this part. Okay. It looks pretty good. Might come in a little bit more right here, just so that it matches the other side a little better. Okay, now I'll dry that up and be on to the next part. Up until now, you've been basically painting by numbers, but now it's time to break out your inner expressionists and get to work on this part here. Okay, take two. So I went down a long procedure of paints, and it actually looked good. It looked very interesting. It was a neat effect, but it just wasn't quite right for Sabine's helmet. So this is a different approach. Now that I have that experience, I can pick some better directions now. So what we have here is I've painted this entire area with light portrait pink. And now I'm basically gonna go over that whole area with cadmium red light hue. Make sure it's not so thick that the pink underneath isn't affecting the color. So basically, if you put this on opaque, it's going to be basically just the red, and you won't get any of the effect of the pink underneath it. I'm going to blow dry this, and we'll be on to the next step. Now that this is all dry, I'm going to take some cadmium red medium hue, and starting just on this side of the center line and just behind where the little hooks are there, I'm going to start out with just a little central little smudge. And I'm just going to work some little streaks kind of out toward this back wing and then kind of back over toward this little winglet thing. And then a few sort of 90 degrees to those. Just a few lines coming out from the center. Okay, and I'm going to dry that. So the next step is some of this quinacridone magenta. I'm going to take a slightly smaller brush this time. Okay, and I'm just going to kind of go over some of the same areas. I'm trying to blend this in a little bit more instead of just being just kind of lightly, wildly going around. I'm going to try to blend this into sort of the surrounding area as well as I can. So sort of the main areas are sort of this axis here, and then a little bit across here. Don't follow every little part of the red that you'd put on earlier, just kind of go in some of those areas. Kind of maintain mostly this kind of area and a little bit 90 degrees to that. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, so that's it for the darker colors. Now I need to bring some light colors in here. Okay, so what I'm after is kind of a pale mint. I'm looking in the camera, it looks way more green than mint. Okay, now I'm just going to start right along this edge where this little hook is right there to a little bit, pretty close to the middle part of this eyelash. And I'm just kind of dabbing it on there. want to blend out the edges so they kind of blends away. Oh, and it doesn't show up anywhere near that well. I'm looking at it with my eyes, and then I look on camera and it's like way more intense on camera. And one more little area here. See if I can get something up here. Don't want to cover up too much of the nice dark area that we've got. Boy, that looks way more intense on camera. But we're not done with that, but I am going to go ahead and dry this. Before I dried this, I looked at a picture of her helmet and I added a few more parts and sort of connected some of the other parts together. Basically, it just kind of runs off and on down this kind of area. It kind of curves around here and kind of branches back up in toward that center red section here. And as it comes down here, it kind of anvils out. I actually don't think this piece right here was in the picture, but I already put it there, so. And I don't think it actually gets anywhere near this far down here as far as the side. So. Okay, I apologize for jumping around so much. I ended up looking at some pictures of her helmet again, and I just felt like this minty green was a little bit too intense. So I mixed up some more of the color, but I added some black to it just to tone it down a little bit. And I painted it back over on top of what I already had. It's still way more intense on the screen than it is looking at it with my eyes, but it is what it is. This is still pretty intense in through here, and so I want to try to mellow this out a little bit. I really like the color of mint that I have now, but it's still pretty a dramatic change from the red to the green. I've worked on it a little bit already, so it's a little better than it was, but it still needs some more work. So what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of stipple some color, some of the red onto the green and some of the green onto the red. And in order to do that, the obvious thing would be if you can find a natural sponge, something that's actually made for sponge painting, that kind of thing. You can also use a stipple brush, which you can find at most painting, home painting places. Or if you can find one of these little stippling foam sponges, it's just a little for making patterns and things like that. you don't want it to be flat like this, you know. So what I do is I just take my fingers, my fingernails I should say, and especially you don't want this round edge. And you don't want to be real consistent about this. You just want to tear big and little pieces off of here. Okay. You just want to work on this until you get a nice uneven sort of random shape. And now you can use that to just do some shapes here. I'm going to take some of this the cadmium red light hue. And I'm just going to add a little bit of white to that. Just to lighten it up a bit, because when you put this cadmium light red onto the green, it gets really dark. So by just adding a little white to that to bring it up a little bit, and that way it won't just be like a dark gray spot on there. And so to use one of these, just kind of move the paint into a reasonably large area. Then you can just take this and tap it down. You want it to be kind of irregular. Get a lot of it off. And then you just kind of come over and make sure that you rotate this in between when you stamp down with it, because you don't want identical pattern of shapes. I'll show you on this paper here. If I go there, 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 you don't want to repeat that shape. You don't want that repeating shape like that. You want to rotate in between so that you just get sort of a random set of shapes. Now I did this with the big one. Usually when you buy these, there are lots of different sizes. I'm actually going to go to the smaller size here. Do it until there's not a whole lot of big blobs of paint. And then mostly I'm going to concentrate on the edges between the green and the red. And it shouldn't be a real dramatic amount of paint. There should be just little bits there. I'm just trying to make it where it's not so graphic, where it's like a green edge and a red edge right there together. I just want to kind of blend those a little bit. And then I want to do the same thing with the green. Now to do that, I need to mix up some more of that green. And I'm going to show you a simpler, less complicated way of doing that with fewer paints. So what I have here is the titanium white. This is the Mars black. And I'm going to add some phthalocyanine green, just a little bit. May add just a little bit more than that. And don't worry about trying to remember how to spell phthalocyanine. I will write everything down in the description. So I'm going to start with a fairly large amount of white. I just want to separate that from the rest of this white. So you start with a fairly large amount of white, and to that I'm just going to add a little bit of green. I'm just going to do that until I get this light mint color. Like I said, it doesn't take very much green at all to get that. Now I'm going to take an even smaller amount of the Mars Black, just tiny amounts, and I'm going to add the Mars Black in there slowly. Adding very small amounts of black. And you just add black until you get the color you're looking for. Still just a little bit light. Tiny amounts of black. It's really very dull color that you're looking for. We're actually really close, just a tiny bit more black. That's starting to look pretty good. Yep, that matches perfectly. So I just take my little stippling device. And I'll make sure there's not a lot of paint on there, just a little bit of paint on there. And once again, I'm mostly concentrating on the edge, around the edge between the green and the red. I'm turning in between each time I've tapped down. And once you get it pretty well blended, once you get those edges pretty well blended, then I'm just going to go with the larger size. And I can do larger areas. Okay, and I'm actually fairly happy with that. I think that looks pretty good. I've spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out what to do here. I'm finally happy with it. You know, I really like the way the gray silver combination looks. I'm very tempted to leave it the way it was, just with that on the bottom. But you know, it's not the way it looks. So I guess in general, we're basically going to cover all the silver up. So when you very start painting, I wouldn't bother putting the silver on. I would just cover everything with the neutral gray. Because now we're going to cover up the rest of the silver pretty much. Although I do like the way it looks. And what you're going to want is start out with your titanium white and add to that a little bit of raw umber. This would probably be a good one to mix up in a container, like a little Dixie cup or something like that. Add a little bit more of the raw umber. Basically what you're after is just kind of a champagne color, a light warm gray. You don't necessarily have to do this, but I'm going to add just a tiny bit of burnt umber. I just want to warm this up ever so slightly. Like in the glare, I can't tell it's doing anything. That looks pretty good. So mostly white, a little bit of raw umber, and a tiny bit of burnt umber. It might take a couple of coats to make it a nice coat, you know, to really cover this without making it look just totally brushstrokey. Try to keep your brush strokes horizontal. And for the front, I just kind of follow the shape of the helmet. Okay, I'm going to finish this part off camera so that I can actually get in there and do it, and I'll be right back. Okay, so here it is. And you can definitely see some lighter and darker areas. So I'm going to blow dry this, and then I'm going to put another coat on, just the same thing right on top of this one. And I'll be right back. Okay, so this is all dry, 2 coats, and I also went ahead and did the little side pieces around the yellow there. Okay, so now that you have this, it looks kind of flat, a little too, you know, it just doesn't look right. So what we're gonna do now is take some of the silver, and we're just gonna go over all of that champagne or beige color with the silver. And the silver is very transparent, very translucent. So you can see it really well if the light's hitting from one way. If it's hitting from a different, you can't see it at all. But definitely put it on in smooth horizontal strokes. And it's just one of those colors that's prone to sort of concentrating in one spot and not in another. So we'll have to make a couple of coats. In the front, just like before, we're going to follow the helmet shape. You can see it's kind of rough in there, so I'm going to go ahead and do a second coat, and then I'll let you see that. I'm going to do exactly the same as I did this one. Okay, so I put on the second coat and everything's dry, and I know it kind of looks like it's silver again, but it definitely has that sort of a champagne tone to it. And it'll be more evident when we put the silver stripes in, which is the next thing we need to do, actually. So we'll do that as soon as I get back. So I've got my soft lead pencil, and you can do this a couple of different ways. One thing you can do is you can take your ruler and you can decide what you want to do, whether it be an 1/8 or a 1/16 or whatever. It needs to be fairly wide. The most important thing is it needs to be consistent. So I'm going to pick an 1/8. So one thing you could do is you can just kind of go around and mark 1/8 every so often. And then just go in and essentially connect the dots. You just want to follow this line of the shape that you're outlining. You can do that for the whole thing. Or you can just sort of guess at it. And when you come to a pointed area, you need to make sure that you come out far enough for both parts to be 1/8 of an inch out. Now the eyeball itself doesn't get one. And it looks to me like I've kind of widened things out a little bit here, so I'm gonna okay. Okay, once you have everything outlined, this is my trusty silver pen by Pilot silver marker. These work really well. Now this one is a very fine tip, but I'm just going to basically do the outlines. Try to be as smooth as you can. These outlines need to be almost like tape. You know, they need to be really consistent. If it won't work, just tap it a few times on some paper. Okay, and now I'm just going to fill in the rest of it. I have to tell you, if I had known that this texture was going to continue to stay on, I never would have used that hammered metallic spray paint to begin with. Okay, there's one. Now you need to do everything else. So as it turns out, 1/8 of an inch is a little bit thick. So I actually came in with the blue paint and I shrunk that down a little bit, so it's a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch. And you can see my widths are a little bit off, but they're fairly consistent, at least within the shape itself. So that's what you want. You just want it to be very consistent, not wiggly, not get thinner and thicker. It doesn't have to be exact, it just needs to look consistent. And so you can see you want to do these pieces, but not the eye. You do this piece here, but only as far as between the visor and this black piece here, the cheekbone. We're going to do all of these pieces here, all the way up. And I think that's it. You kind of have to make a judgment call as you're going along. Sometimes you're going to want to put your line out away from the edge, but on occasion you'll probably want to go ahead and make the outer edge, you know, the same as the edge, and I'll come inside that to make the line. If I'd made that on the inside, it just would have been way too small. So now I'm going to go ahead and do the inside edge. And if I get a little thick with my outline, I can always go back with some black and clean it up, just like I did with the blue over here. I'm going to give this a few minutes to dry before I go on, that way I don't end up with a big smudge somewhere. Okay, I finished the outlines up on this side. There's a few places where I want to go back, either fill a gap, like right in here, or at a couple places where I want to actually make the silver a little smaller. And I'm using the Mars black for this just because the ivory black is a little bit too translucent to cover anything up. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we have the lines that go here. Now I've seen some pictures where I thought they were silver because they're lighter than the surrounding black, but in 99% of the pictures that I've seen, they're darker, and they're quite a bit darker. So to me, what that's telling me is that it's a very glossy black outline. So I'm just going to use one of my Sharpies . I don't know if you can see this or not. I saw the screen just get really dark. Try to make it as smooth as possible because it will be visible. Okay. Now about the same size as I did the silver. Okay, and now for the top. Okay. There you have it. It's looking pretty good. Now I just have to do the exact same thing on this side. Okay, before we get any further, we've kind of forgotten about this piece. And all I've done here is hit it with a couple of layers of the gray primer, and then gave it the same treatment as we did here. So the 3 different colors of paint on here, and then I painted this white, and that's everything for it. We'll have to come back and weather it later, but for now, that's everything. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do as far as weathering and aging the helmet is, right now it's just really clean and bright, and I want to take that down just a notch. So I've just got some flat black Krylon paint, and I'm just going to lightly spray the helmet, but I'm going to do it from at least maybe 3 feet away. Looks like the wind's being a bit of an issue. And it's sort of the red and the blue that I'm mostly interested in. See if I can do this without my shadow completely darkening everything up. Oh, it's getting really turbulent now. The real danger with this process is that it's kind of subtle, and so you can kind of get a little bit out of control. You don't see what's happening, and you can kind of take it a little bit too far. So take it slow. Seems to affect the yellow more than anything else. So be careful with that. Try to keep at least 3 feet out. Okay, I'm going to call that done. It still kind of looks bright to me, but I'm afraid when I get it out of this bright light that it's going to be darker than I think. So that's it for that. Okay, so the next step is going to be, I'm going to hit this whole thing with a dulling spray, or basically a matte finish. You can find almost any paint area that has spray paint. It's going to have some sort of matte spray. I really like this Model Masters. It just has a lusterless flat. It's a lacquer overcoat. You can get it at most hobby stores, art stores as well. Any place that does a lot of models. It's a small can, but it still seems to last pretty well. And I really like the finish that it gives. I'm going to shake it up good. I've already shaken this for over a minute, so. You just want to hold it about a foot away from the surface. This stuff's pretty potent too, so you definitely want to be in a well-ventilated area or wear a respirator. You definitely don't want to stop in the middle of your motion on this, because if you get a real thick coat, it'll be more of a gloss finish instead of a matte finish. Okay, clear that out, and we'll be on to the next thing. Okay, so the last step in the sort of dirtying up the helmet is I've just got some of my latex paints. I've got the ivory white, the ivory black, some raw umber, and some burnt umber. And we're back to the stippling brush and the little stippling sponges that we made. So I'm going to start out with some white. As I can do before, I'm just going to spread some white out in kind of a large enough area. I'm going to take the stippling brush, kind of get some on there, and then I'm going to just kind of hit it on some paper until there's not much that's going to come off anymore. I also have another rag here so I can kind of wipe most of it off. Now, just like I did before, I'm turning the brush every time I touch it down. I'm just kind of breaking up the solid blue. It looks a little bit too perfect. Didn't even mean to hit that one, and I got it pretty good. Whenever I get a really bright white speckle, I want to go ahead and wipe that down. And even though I'm shooting for the blue mostly, I'm going to go ahead and go into the red and the green and the black as well. Try not to get too much just in a line. Okay, now I'm going to do the exact same thing with the black. Really push it down and make sure you're not going to get any dark spots. And I'm just going to do the same thing. If you get any real dark black spots, then you want to wipe those down. Somehow I got some white in there as well. Going to be as random as you can. And if you need to, you can always come back with the silver and clean up your line if you feel like you need to. Okay, it looks pretty good actually. I'm pretty happy with that. Maybe get a little bit of the black. Be careful in this really light areas. Keep that. Nothing too extreme, you just want to get a little bit. Okay. And I'm going to do the same thing with the umbers, but I'm going to be much more sparing with those. I'm really, at this point, I'm just kind of doing a little bit of dirt. You know, some of the little dirt, mud splashed up on the helmet. Kind of breaking that up a little bit. It looks a little bit too even, so. Okay. That was the raw umber. This is going to be the burnt umber, and I'm going to be very sparing with this. Okay, and that's it for that part. And that's pretty much it as far as dirtying up the helmet. Now we're going to scratch up the helmet. We're going to change gears here. I'm going to a oil-based Rust-Oleum aluminum. And you want to get an old beat up brush. This is the one that I was using to dust it way earlier in the process. It's not very good for painting, but it's yeah, it'll be good for this. It's a little dusty. And what I want to do is just dip it in a little bit and paint, you know, brush off all of the paint pretty much. Try to get all of that paint off. Once you got the vast majority of the paint off, you just want to very lightly kind of brush across at different angles the edges. I'm avoiding this area in here where I painted the black down to simulate the edge is not really there. I'm also kind of trying to avoid getting too much in these areas where the blue is there, because I don't want to just cover it up. Yeah, I think I'm going to go with a smaller brush. This one's nice and beat up, and it looks like I used it in the past for the same thing. Just get a little bit of paint. This one actually might be just a little bit too beat up, but it'll work for some things. We need to do the bottom edge pretty much all the way around. It looks very subtle on camera, but it's a little bit more dramatic than that. It's funny how things look quite different on the camera. You're going to go from all different angles. So this should look like, you know, months of hard use, not, you know, like it went through a machine. I'm avoiding that area right now. This area actually gets quite a bit of work. And I'll go back up and clean up that part of that edge later on. Doesn't have to all be real severe. It could be just lightly scratched. I'm mostly going for the corner itself. And for this ear area, even though it's all yellow, I noticed that the actual face of it has the paint's worn off all around the edges. Definitely don't make it all the same. You know, more here, less here, and that looks pretty good. Gonna lightly scratch off. I think I'm going to change brushes again. If you don't like the way your brush is going, you know, find a different one. Okay, let's try this one. That one looks pretty good. I like that effect. So again, I'm going from different angles. Corners especially. So not all the same, but some areas have paint, other areas will be, you know, worn much worse. This ear is similar to the other one in that, yes, the front is completely painted, but it's also been worn and scratched to where it's not all the way to the edge. I think that area will be reasonably protected, so I'm not going to do very much for that. And more down here again. I'm going to get pretty much all the paint off with just the smallest hint of paint. But I'm going to do some interior scratches. Still a little too much paint, I think, there. Definitely don't forget through the bottom edge. I would think this little part of the ear would get beat up pretty good. So I'm trying to avoid this somewhat just because I don't want to cover up all the blue. Okay, this is just has very little on it at all, and I'm just going to go scratches here and there that are pretty bad. You know what? I think I'm going to call that done. Now, you're going to want to find some paint thinner and clean out your brushes. We'll come back for the very last part, which is going to be the tint for the helmet. Okay, don't clean your brushes just yet. I keep forgetting about the rangefinder. This actually gets pretty scratched up, and my memory was totally wrong. That doesn't get anywhere near that scratched up, so I only scratch it to where it's kind of like everything else, and then it just kind of flares out to maybe 1/4 of an inch in the middle, and then smaller again as it goes out. So I'm gonna have to go in and repaint part of that. But I can't do that until this paint completely dries, because with this being an oil-based paint, it's not going to let the acrylic stick to it. But back to this. You want to get every corner and get it well. This thing apparently is beat up pretty good. Just don't get any on the white. Okay, it looks pretty beat up. Okay, we'll let that dry as well. Visor tint is up next. One last thing before we add the visor tint, and that is, let's finally go ahead and add this on now that we've painted it and it's dry. I've just coated this with a layer of barge cement, both the top and the sides, and the same here all the way across. Now this is just a little bit loose for it to glue everywhere, so I'm really going to concentrate on sticking it on the top onto here, and then this front edge here, or the edge that faces in toward the helmet. And it's been about 10 minutes since I put it on there. I have to force it a little bit. That looks really good, actually. Now you could also use goop or even super glue for that. I was really tempted to use Amazing Goop, but that takes 24 hours to cure, and I'm in a little bit of a hurry, so I went with the barge cement. Now if you want to, you can fill in these little gaps here. You can fill these little gaps here with wood putty and then paint them. I think it kind of looks good the way it is, so I think I'm just going to leave it. So the last thing we're going to do now is to carefully remove this masking tape, and then we can use that as our pattern to cut out the tint. And I'm just going to lightly run my X-Acto knife along this edge just to cut any paint that may have kind of glued itself in place. Be careful not to cut into the foam at the top or bottom. If you do end up cutting into the foam when the piece comes off, then you'll just have to paint over to cover it. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to carefully start peeling this up, and I can immediately see that there's, okay, you know what, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the tape off the inside. So now let's go ahead and remove this. Okay, now I can see there's some tape that's trying to leave a piece of tape, so I need to come in and very carefully. You don't have to use an X-Acto knife for this. You can use your fingernail, or just, you know, whatever you can use to pry the tape up. Especially be careful if you're working right where you're going to be looking. Okay. And we have our pattern that we can use for the tint. Okay, so all I've done is I've taken a piece of my tint, and you can get this window tint at, I got this at Home Depot. You're going to be able to find it at Home Depot, Lowe's, pretty much any of the big box home stores. Most hardware stores are going to carry it. It's just going to be over with the other window things. This is the darkest window tint, which looks really good on the helmet. I'll let you know in the future whether or not you can see in the dark with it. You know, if you're going to be walking around at night, it might be problematic. You might want to go with a lighter tint for that. When you get the tint, make sure that you also get the activation solution. You can definitely get it in a smaller bottle usually. I had to buy it in this big pump bottle. I've just taken my masking tape that I pulled off the helmet and just stuck it directly down on the front side of the tint. You don't want to you don't want to put it on the paper side, because then it'll be backwards. And I'm using a silver Sharpie, and I'm just going to trace around. It's going to be rough, but that's okay. Believe it or not, this does not have to fit perfectly. But it can't be too big. If it's too big, you'll have to trim it. If it's a little bit small, that's not really a problem. Okay. So once you have it outlined, just pull it off. Next, I'm just going to cut this out. And I want to cut on the inside of the lines. Okay, this is all cut out now. Now you want to make sure that you clean the visor really good, at least on the outside. Because if there's any dust or anything, it'll definitely stand out when you put this tint on it. And as it is, if you put it on there and there's a big, it's a little piece of dust, but it'll make a big pimple. And, the best thing to do is just to peel it off. It's no big deal. Peel it off, clean that piece of dust off, and put it back on. So all you have to do is peel the paper off. Spray the visor, spray your film, there's usually a little squeegee that kind of comes along, but it's really not necessary. In fact, it's probably, your fingers are going to be way more helpful in this particular case. You should be able to just move things around. They should slide. Spray some on there, mostly just for lubrication, so you can move things around without too much effort. It looks good. And if there's any silver on your tint where you made your outline or anything like that, you can just go back in with a black Sharpie and cover it up. And there you have it. The only thing that I have left at this point is to have my daughter try it on, and if the eyes are too far down for her eyes, then I'll put some foam at the top of the helmet to lift the helmet up. If it lines up perfectly, then I won't. I'll add some pieces of foam on the inside wherever I need to, just so that it is tight enough around her head that it doesn't shake around everywhere. So it'll be, reasonably, secure to her face, but that she can still take the helmet on and off. That's it. So there it is in all of its glory. I'm pretty happy with it. It turned out, I think, pretty nice. If you're not super happy with your helmet, do not get discouraged. Sometimes it takes a couple of tries to get it right. This is the first Boba Fett helmet that I made. And at the time I was pretty pleased with it. this is literally the second Boba Fett helmet that I made. So it's, you know, quite a bit nicer. I'm not that happy with this one, to be honest, but this one I'm very pleased with. And I did do a Jango Fett helmet in between the two, but you know, essentially I did this one, and then from the things that I learned here, I was able to put that here and do a much nicer job. So don't be discouraged. I know it's hard to start over again, but you'll find that it's actually much easier the second time, and it'll be much faster, and it's definitely worth the effort.
Well, congratulations. You've made it to the end. And whether you've decided to go the Season 3 route or something completely different, I hope you found this video and series helpful. I know I've learned a lot making Sabine's helmet, and it's been great fun. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and post them below. I'll do my best to help out, and to be honest, your comments are the only real way that I know that people are watching. Why not go ahead and like this video? It really does help. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss out on any upcoming videos about her arms and armor. Because, let's face it, a helmet alone isn't much of a costume. Again, I had a blast working on this project, and I can't wait to get started on the next one. So, until next time, thanks.